of resentment that had pervaded the once friendly Nick on his behalf when it became clear that he wasn't going to be allowed to stay on. Of course, not everyone had been on his side. Most of the brass seemed to think he was bloody lucky to keep his position of DC at all, and not be demoted back down into uniform, or even prosecuted. But there would have been one hell of a stink if they'd tried that on, Keith thought with some satisfaction, and then caught sight of his defiant grin in the driving mirror. Quickly he wiped it off. He hadn't met his new DI yet, but he was damn sure a cocky grin wouldn't go down too well. As his dad had kept on saying only last weekend, as he'd helped his son move his stuff from the East End of London to the rarefied suburb of the university city, he needed to keep his head down and play it clever, maybe even eat humble pie for a while, if need be, but most of all to think of it as a new start and a new chance to shine. Ever since joining the force, Keith had been determined to get out of uniform and start doing some real detective work, locking up the bastards who preyed on ordinary decent folk like his own mum and dad. To actually make a difference to some poor sod's quality of life by collaring hooligans and vandals who specialised in tyrannising the elderly or young. The fact he could still feel that way, even after how he'd been treated back at Blacklock Green, was, he supposed, at least something. He hadn't let that bastard of a sergeant wear him down completely. He carefully kept an eye on the buildings leading off in his right, remembering from his brief orientation interview last week that the HQ was situated nearly halfway down the main road, not far from a big comprehensive school. Spotting the large signpost at last just outside a narrow access road, Keith indicated and pulled in, but struggled to find a parking space. His shift didn't officially start until 8:30, and he had a good 10 minutes to spare, but it didn't do to be late on his first day. As he climbed out of the car, he wondered yet again what his new boss was going to be like. Detective Inspector HILLARY GREENE. He'd done the usual asking around, of course, but information had been sketchy. Not many of his still loyal mates back at Blacklock Green knew much about Thames Valley, so what he'd managed to glean had been mostly trawled from the internet, scuttlebutt and guesswork. His friends had ribbed him a bit about working for a woman, but Keith thought it might not be such a bad thing. He certainly didn't think he had any hang-ups about taking orders from a woman, unlike some. Who knows, it might even work out. As he walked towards the entrance and pushed through the door, he thought, fatalistically, that she could hardly be worse than the last bastard he'd worked for. About 10 miles away, Caroline Weeks walked down her short concrete pathway and pushed open her garden gate. She was a tall woman, with short dark hair and large chocolate-coloured eyes, and wore a long beige Burberry mac belted tightly against the wind and threatening rain. The neighbour's cat, a large fat ginger Tom, spotted her coming and jumped up onto the top of the neat brick garden wall that surrounded her property and arched his back, already anticipating the warm caress of her hand. The sight of the friendly Moggy lifted her vague sense of depression and brought a smile to her face. "Hey there, Spartacus. Not been after the sparrows, I hope." She stroked the hard, furry head that butted into her palm with typical cat-like ecstasy and listened to the loud rumbling purr. Every morning she left for work, and more often than not had to pay the cat the usual toll. She smiled at her neighbour who was climbing into his car, then gave the cat a final chuck under the chin and moved off down the road. She usually caught the bus at the end of the street, since she only worked in the market square and it never seemed worth the bother to take the second car. Once at the bottom of the road, however, she crossed over at the corner and after a short while veered off the pavement to enter a little cul-de-sac of council houses. Caroline was 39, but managed, with a strict exercise regime and careful dieting, to look much younger. A flair for clothes and an expert hand with makeup also helped, and her short bob of brown hair was always maintained in a careful cut. Those who knew her had never been able to understand why her